So this is going to be a different kind of talk than some of the other talks that we've seen. I'm going to sort of situate the next couple of talks that you're going to hear, because I think that they're among the most important things that are out there happening right now in transformative technology. As you might imagine, we have the whole sort of landscape in our heads, so that's sort of a big deal. I want to first of all thank all of you for coming very much. You know, the transformative technology is you. It's not really us. We're sort of the ones that pick the food. But that's it, right? The rest of it is it's entirely about you. So thank you very much for coming. Many of you know my personal story, which is simply that about 12 years ago, 15 years ago or so, I was quite successful. I had businesses, and I'd done, many things with my life, lots of awards and whatnot. But despite all of that, I wasn't really that happy. Now, I wasn't miserable. This isn't some existential, I was crying alone every night or something like that kind of story, right? But I just couldn't help but notice that there were other people that were a lot happier than I was. And since I was working like 16 hours to 18 hours a day, like really trying to push stuff forward in my own life and my own companies and whatnot, that just didn't seem fair. It didn't seem fair that I was working so incredibly hard, and yet there were all of these people out there who didn't seem to be working as hard as I was, who were, so much happier than I was. And I realized that I was sort of at an inflection point in my life, that I could either keep doing more of the same stuff, in which case I could probably expect essentially the same results, no matter how many additional businesses I created and sold, or no matter how many new technologies I came up with, or whatever it was. And so I completely changed my life. Now, it turns out that what I was going through is normal. It just sort of depends where you're at on the spectrum. But essentially, everyone has a fundamental sense of discontentment in them. That is the quote-unquote problem of the human condition, is this sense that something just isn't quite right. And so, people typically have goals, they have dreams, they have all of these things that they think, oh, if I can just achieve that, then I'll be happy. Well, most people don't actually achieve a lot of their goals or dreams or whatever else. They achieve lesser accomplishments, like binge watching HBO series and things, instead of actually getting out and, working 18 hours a day or whatever to sort of achieve their dreams or whatever, right? And so a terrible thing happens actually when you do work 18 hours a day to try to achieve your dreams, and that is you get one thing after another, after another, after another, and you realize the voice in your head telling you that those goals are what's going to make you happy. It's not really telling you the truth. And eventually you achieve enough things and you realize, wow, like happiness probably just is never possible for me. Like I'll probably never be as happy as those other people. I wasn't ready to sort of give in on that. That really is just an evolutionary thing, right? I mean, if a bird lands on a table and you're sitting outside eating and a bird lands next to your table, what does it do? It pecks at the crumb on the ground, and then it immediately starts looking around, right, for what's going to swoop down and kill it. And then it pecks at another crumb, and then it's looking around for what's going to kill it, right? That fundamental discontentment is sort of wired into us by nature, and it makes a lot of sense, and it really should be there. In most cases, it's a very healthy thing to have in there. Generally speaking, if you're living in a place like Palo Alto, you're kind of at the top of the food chain, not being chased by the saber-toothed tiger anymore, and so it might not make as much sense as it does for people in other times or places or whatever else. So I actually took a break, and I liquidated everything, and I basically went back to school, and I studied psychology and neuroscience and transformative studies, and I was really trying to get both sides of the research spectrum because I was determined to solve this problem for myself. I just thought to myself, if other people are happier than I am, there's got to be some chance that I can be one of those people. And I tried all the programs, I bought all kinds of courses, I did all of those things that people typically do. And none of those things really significantly move the needle on that fundamental discontentment. So I sort of thought, okay, I'm going to go see if I can just figure this out. So I acquired the skills to do that. CIS, I think, is probably the best qualitative education you can get, and Harvard's probably the best quantitative education. And I thought, really, I needed both. I needed both forms of research. Of course, neither one of them really consider the other one valid in terms of their research, right? Which is very entertaining when you're trying to be like a teacher's aide at a class at CIS, and you're like, oh, shoot, I've got to turn off the Harvard brain and all that. So the population that wound up winning my question of who are the happiest people on Earth essentially looked like this. And I think there's a tendency for most people to discount these folks, the mystics sort of the world, if you will, the people who are really making sort of extraordinary and what sounded to me, frankly, like somewhat crazy statements about their own internal way of experiencing the world. And in fact, I really couldn't even mention this research population during my time in Boston because there just wasn't going to ever be considered a valid sort of group to study from a psychological standpoint. There was just sort of this belief in them being psychopathological, if you will. Now, for many, many years, we've studied these people, and I don't find psychopathology in this population. I do definitely appreciate the way religions and spirituality and philosophy and many things have carried knowledge of these psychological states across really the rise and fall of empires and other forms of culture and society and whatnot. We know a lot about these ways that you can experience the world, which is sort of a fundamental shift as a result of these institutions, but we don't necessarily have to be hampered by them. It turns out that in our research, our subjects eventually wound up looking like this. They wound up looking like everybody around. So if you just look around right now, there's people in this room that are experiencing this state, right? But because they're not wearing robes or beads or, you know, whatever else, there's one guy with a hair bun, but let's forget about that for the moment. You know, you really can't tell them apart. You can't tell them apart on the surface. And so we wound up with really thousands of subjects like this, thousands of research subjects, or the proper name, research participants these days. How many folks recognize this? You know? Yeah. So Abraham Maslow, right, the world-famous psychologist from the 50s and 60s where he really gained his fame. And this is, of course, his famous pyramid, his hierarchy of needs. You really can't go through high school and college in America with not having had this picture in some textbook at some point, right? It's like the one psychological thing that pretty much everybody has seen in our culture. What you might not have known is that towards the end of his life, Abraham Maslow actually had an experience of this other way that life can unfold. And so he actually talked about it on this forum. Now, he was getting very weak. He had a heart condition for the last couple of years of his life, and he actually wound up dying in June 1970, roughly 6 days before I was born. No, I don't believe that I am the reincarnation of Abraham Maslow, but there would be worse things, frankly. So I'm just putting that meme out there on the camera right now. So I'm leaving this in the slides. I know you all can't read it back there, but we make the slides and the videos and stuff available. And so if somebody's interested in reading it later, you can in his experience. But one thing that it did that he didn't really have the strength to publish and to really put out there at the time was a shift in his pyramid. And what he realized is that he'd kind of made a mistake in what was formerly the top level of his pyramid, which was self-actualization, which was basically being the most amazing individual human being you can. Like individuating as much as you possibly can. Like, I am the best human I can be, right? Well, it turns out that in the end of his work, he considered that actually a transitionary phase to something that was beyond it. And what he describes as beyond it is exactly what showed up in our work, 40 years later or whatever. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We did a couple of studies on this. I think many of you know that we've spent an enormous amount of money and a lot of years researching these populations all around the world. This was our first study. It was about 7 years long or so, although parts of it still continue today. But we were really just trying to sort of ask ourselves, what is the experience like for these people? If we're trying to wrap our arms around a population, first of all, are they nuts? They don't seem to be nuts. And so if they're not nuts, then how are they experiencing the world? We tried all kinds of different ways at getting at that. If you came in, you might have been interviewed, you might have had to fill out a bunch of gold standard measures until you told us you never wanted to hear from us again. You might have had, weird electrodes hooked up to you until you told us you didn't want to hear from us again. But basically, we were just trying everything that we could to differentiate this population. Interestingly, we started with the self-report measures. And the self-report measures didn't show anything except that they were happy, not depressed, not anxious, which is exactly, of course, what they tell you. And that was our first hint, really, that this population was not that measurable by standard psychological instruments. Like, our world of psychology has really developed to study what is the normal human condition. It hasn't really evolved its tools and its measurements and its various self-report scales and stuff like that to measure this population. It took us quite a while to figure that out, although it seems like it should be pretty understandable in hindsight. So what is it that we're talking about here? So I'm going to call this fundamental well-being today. You may know this by some of the other terms that we've used for it, like persistent non-symbolic experience, our more academic term for it, and whatnot. And this is the big change. So these 2 bullet points on the screen right now, this is really the big change. And the big change is simply that it is a shift in your persistent sort of baseline that everything else piles on top of when it's building your experience. It's a shift in that persistent baseline away from that fundamental sense of discontentment and towards something else that is really quite extraordinary, quite remarkable. And that something else is a sense that everything is actually okay. So on the one hand, you have this tremendous sense of discontentment, or even just if you've had an amazing life and you've got plenty of money and you've got great relationships and all of those things that positive psychology has shown us can sort of spike the well-being in normal people, if you've got all of that, there's still this nagging sense that something isn't quite right. And over here, pretty much things are just fine as they are. Now, not in an unhealthy way. Like if you were to pull out a submachine gun right now and start spraying bullets, I wouldn't be like, oh, a submachine gun, oh, bathe me in your bullets. It's so blissful here. I mean, you are very, very functional. But nonetheless, you sort of experience what a friend of mine at Yale calls fundamental okayness. He was really trying to figure out how he could express that. He's in their emotional intelligence area. There's a sense that you don't need to add anything to yourself. So you're not on some quest for self-help products or whatever at this point. We like to say you go from a seeker to a finder and from a finder to an explorer. It's, you might still be examining this or having fun exploring some topic or some self-help thing or whatever else, but you don't really feel a compulsion towards it. Many people don't do any of that. There's reduced or eliminated mental chatter, that voice in your head that you wouldn't mind if it stopped criticizing you so much, basically is the thing that gets dampened down or even eliminated in some forms of this completely. And as a result of that, there's increased or total freedom from those thoughts impacting mood. You're much more present. You're much more in the present moment. Thoughts and memories and stuff that arise spontaneously in other people are really pulling them into the past and pulling them into the future. And that's much less the case for this population. And you have an increased sense of connectedness and possibility and, frankly, a sense of flow. Jamie Wheel and Steve Kotler, good friends of mine, like to say, it's all about task flow, and they're trying to find all of these athletic flow things and Navy SEAL flow things and whatever else, the Stealing Fire book and all that. So they're really into task flow, and I'm like, hey guys, why don't you just have that all the time with life flow? And so we have this sort of ongoing dialogue back and forth between their notion of, well, no, I've got to jump off a bridge attached to a rubber band versus I've got to just stand on the stage or, go get a salad or pee or whatever I'm going to do today. And there's still sort of this sense of flow. So to dig a little bit deeper, and I'm not going to go into this today, we've got all kinds of data out there in other places, and so I'm going to let you find that. But it turns out that you can catalog this experience. There's different categories of this experience. So there's different types. If you wonder why one mystic argues with another mystic, even if they're from the same tradition or whatever else, it's because there's just different categories of the experience. And at a baseline level, you can sort of talk about it very generically and skip over those differences. But we've got that cataloged. This is a gift for you today. I don't know if you've all gotten the bag by the front door. But in the front door, at the front door and in the back of the room, there's basically bags that you should absolutely pick up because there's little goodies in there for you. And one of the goodies that's in there is a book that's going to be released early next year. So you're getting a preprint. Unlike the last conference, your preprint actually does not have 2 chapter 14s, and my name is spelled right. So you're getting a slightly improved preprint version over the last group at the Science and Non-Duality Conference. But this really encapsulates all of that research that we'd done up to that point. Okay, so, up till that point, we thought, hey, we've studied all of these people and they experienced this, and isn't that great? And then we started to ask ourselves, how can we get research data on before and after, right? Because it's not like you can just look out in a crowd and be like, you're about to transition. Let's come into the lab so that we can measure you before and after, right? We really had to, in some way, sort of, create a process. And I knew everybody in the world sort of in this sort of enlightenment type space at this point, right? And I knew that there wasn't a method out there that was like reliably transitioning people, such that you could spend thousands of dollars on a research subject and have that be a good investment because you could guarantee that they were going to transition. So we started a movement called enlightenment engineering, which, as you can imagine, attracted roughly 3 people who were interested in that, right? So I really brainstormed and I thought, okay, branding, right? PNSE engineering. Yeah, 0 people, right? I mean, what the heck's PNSE, right? At least people knew what enlightenment was. Okay, wait. Transformative technology. And presto, you're all at a conference for transformative technology. So what basically occurred to me was, hey, why don't we make a broader movement, and maybe in the middle of that movement we will find people who are interested. It'll still be a small number of people that are interested in engineering sort of this other level, this other type of human well-being, but we'll find them, we'll sort of attract them, we'll sort of pull them in, and that's exactly what happened. So there is sort of a heart of TransTech that is this type of engineering, and then there's, of course, TransTech has gotten quite huge. If you think about it, TransTech's been around a long time. Everything up here I can talk about in technical terms, like the fire in the top right corner is a 10 hertz flicker around a fire. They've actually measured like the footpaths around the fire and what the flicker rate would have been and stuff like that. And now you're basically getting devices that send 10 hertz signals into your brain in different ways. And so, 70s and 80s and whatnot, you had this technology. Today we have this type of technology. In recent years, this ecosystem has grown to the point where this is sort of the business case. How much are you willing to pay to have more of the blue and less of the gray? And the answer is tens of billions of dollars, basically, at this point in this particular ecosystem. And so it's grown much broader than the ideas of fundamental well-being, but nonetheless, that's still really my core interest and what I work on most of the time, and what this whole thing was built around. So this slide has been in my slide deck for years. I used to say to people, there's a couple of different ways we can get there. We can get there with neurofeedback, and we can get there with neurostimulation. And so this was the neurostimulation slide. And we've basically followed this path. It's kind of incredible, but we started off with measuring, trying to figure out, okay, so who are you in your brain with EEG, MRI, real-time feedback MRI, MEG, all of these different technologies that basically gave us a picture of what was going on in the brain. Now, the problem with that, this is one of the people who did some of that work, Judd Brewer, who was really one of the early people that did some fMRI work in this space and that was kind of interested in this. You can see this is basically a pattern that repeated itself. For those of you that don't know what you're looking at regions in the brain that are really, really deep in the brain. They're really, really hard to get to, right? And so when we thought, okay, we're going to zap people into these, the problem is it was with the technologies like you just heard from Bashar a minute ago. And they're really quite limited in terms of their ability to reach deeply into the brain. We tried, and we tried, and we tried, and we tried. Even went to China and tried, and whatever else, but it just didn't work. And so we thought, okay, well, we're going to need some other way to get this before and after thing. And you've probably heard about what came from that. Ben actually mentioned it on stage, so have some others. And that was our Finder's Course experiments, right, where we really just took some data that said, what is it that worked for you, right? So if you've got thousands of people in PNSE and you say to them, hey, what actually shifted you? Surprisingly, it's a handful of meditation type methods when it's not severe depression or something else, which also you can find in some of my other talks works. And so we basically thought, okay, well, at that point, I spent a lot of money on this. I mean, a lot of money and a lot of time for a lot of years. And I thought, I should stop paying for this, or I'm not going to be able to eat soon. And so we basically transformed it into what became really the world's largest crowdsourced and crowdfunded experiment. Still, I don't know if it'll ever pay me back. I doubt it. But at least it sort of sustains itself, and it sustains people participating in it and whatnot. Now, those experiments were very successful. We basically had a 70% success rate or so, slightly more than 70% success rate in terms of people transitioning. So you come into the program, we measure you, and we can do good science that way because we have a differentiating group that doesn't transition, so we've got kind of a control group of sorts built in. But 70%, if any of you have been to meditation retreats or anything like that, it's an insanely high hit rate. We've collected all kinds of scientific data. Again, you can see other presentations on non-symbolic.org or here, or pretty much I talk about this all the time. So this was, for instance, changes in people everybody that went through the course. And this were some changes in people who achieved sort of fundamental well-being versus those who didn't achieve fundamental well-being. Either they had temporary sort of peak experiences or no experience at all. And so, for instance, you had basically a 60% lower score than the people who didn't achieve fundamental well-being if you did achieve fundamental well-being. That's what those percentages mean. Again, this is all stuff I've presented before, but I just want to show you that there is a very clear distinction, basically, between people on the other side of a transition like this. It is a different way. It is a fundamentally different way of experiencing life, really, and I think a far better way of experiencing life. But there's a problem with the Finder's course in that it doesn't scale. So fortunately, think about what is it that everybody wants? This, right? I mean, you want a pill, you want to be like, and with your book, you're getting a little pink tablet, right? And all you have to do is take that pink tablet and presto, you will be in bliss or whatever else. And okay, we could hand those out. Those exist, right? But we can't do that legally yet. And so we need some other sort of technology, right, to be able to do that. So that it will not scale without an easy button. Everybody in this room can use something like the Finder's course. You can dedicate enough time, you can participate in the experiment, you're all good to go, but there's billions of people out there for whom that will never be a solution. And so the question is, what is it that they can use? Fortunately for us, that last category of brain stimulation, while we were messing around with a meditation course, other people were actually advancing the technology and science that can reach down into those deeper areas of the brain. And so that is ultrasound and various forms of ultrasound. Basically, it's exactly what it sounds like. Ultrasound in your womb, when you're pregnant, you see the baby and all of that. If you're a stroke victim and you're in the hospital, they're doing ultrasound to sort of figure out where your blood clots might be or how much damage there is and that kind of stuff. So this is a very well-used technology for imaging. This is not for imaging, this is for stimulation. This is for very precisely trying to hit certain parts of the brain. So this is a friend of ours. He spoke at the conference, I think maybe the first year. I can't remember now. Stuart Hameroff from the University of Arizona is a professor of anesthesiology. But more than that, he has this theory of consciousness around microtubules being sort of the key seat of consciousness. And one day, one of his friends basically was able to measure the frequency response of microtubules, and part of it wound up being in the ultrasound range. And so he was sort of looking around his hospital where he was working as an anesthesiologist, and there's this ultrasound machine sitting there, and he's like, right? Oh, hey, take a picture while I'm doing it, will you? And so thus we have the famous photograph of Stuart Hameroff with a smile on his face, hoping he lives. And he did. The good news, he's totally fine, as far as we can tell. Same Stu we've always known. That led to, of course, you're in a university teaching system. What do you have? Graduate students, right? Graduate student sees him putting on his head. It's like, that's cool. But graduate students are let's just say younger and maybe a little less jaded and possibly a little smarter. And so they think to themselves, not so much, no, you, come here. Right? So you have the great lab rats of science, undergraduate students in psychology courses, and you bring them in and you put the ultrasound on their head just to see how it goes, before. So this is actually Jay Sanguinetti who was our next speaker, when he was in graduate school. I love this photo. I didn't actually know it existed until I was searching the internet a few days ago. So my whole end of my presentation changed because of that photo. I just thought I've got to use that photo somehow. This is Jay today, and he's sitting in the front row, and he'll be up next. But this is Jay today in a lab that we basically built for this. And so this is how far the technology has come. If instead of using a medical ultrasound device that's designed to look to see what your brain looks like after you've had a stroke or if you're about to have a baby or whatever, if instead you spend many hundreds of thousands of dollars and you ask yourself sort of what can really be done with this, you wind up with a setup that looks a little like this. So that, I don't know if you recognize the guy sitting there. For those of you that are into meditation, maybe you do. He's a famous meditation teacher named Shinzen Young. And he's actually the person that talked Jay into putting ultrasound into the brain in sort of a certain way. And so we owe a tremendous amount actually to these two people, because they almost sort of single-handedly made all of this possible. Shinzen with his, reckless disregard for his own brain in service of enlightenment, in service of further enlightenment. And it wasn't really, right? I mean, he's if you know anything about him, he's a great neuroscience guy. He's read everything. I mean, he's very, he's not reckless with his own brain by any stretch of the imagination. But he really believed, as you'll hear in Jay's talk, he really believed that this was the technology that he'd been waiting for a long time, just like I've sort of been out there for many years with that goofy slide with the arrow made in a previous version of PowerPoint when it was terrible, saying essentially the same thing. And Shinzen actually was able to experience this, and I'll let Jay in his talk tell you a little bit more about what Shinzen experienced. But it really convinced me when Jay's somebody that I've known for years. We try to keep our fingers on all the technology pies and whatnot for transformative technology. And I was speaking at a conference earlier this year, a conference that actually he co-organizes, one of the big consciousness conferences, the main academic consciousness conference. And he was telling me the story about, what he was doing with Shinzen and what the results that he was seeing and whatever. And it really convinced me, holy cow, we might actually be at the moment where we've waited for many, many, many years. Before the Finder's course, I really felt it was 5 to 10 years before this type of technology matured. It wound up being about 5 years, frankly. And we weren't the ones who were going to build that technology. It really had to be someone more like Jay. And so I flew to Albuquerque, and I put the technology in my own head. And what amazed me is that in a very, very, very short period of time, you're talking about a matter of minutes, it really put me into a very deep and very profound state of fundamental well-being. Now, I had since shifted to fundamental well-being as more of a persistent state, so that was money well spent, and a research direction and a life turn and whatever well taken for me. But this technology was clearly able to modulate that in a very, very significant way. And so one of the things that I'd always sort of hypothesized about is that these categories, these clusters of experience relating to fundamental well-being that had showed up in our cross-cultural map of the territory, sitting down with so many people all around the world and inquiring into their experience and trying to figure out how they were similar or different from each other, I'd always sort of suspected that this was what the brain did sort of left to its own devices, right? That if you were severely depressed, if you were suicidally depressed, and the razor blade is right there, a certain percentage of people shift into fundamental well-being. A huge percentage of people slice the razor blade through and die, right? But there is a small percentage of people who transition to fundamental well-being from the absolute depths of suicidal depression. It's like they just self-objectify so much. Many, many meditation people and contemplative prayer people and whatever all over the world seem to have, developed knowledge over centuries of how to work internally with processes and kind of work with the brain and sort of get to these places, another way of getting there. It just seemed to make sense to me, based on the neuroscience education that I'd received, that these were probably organic unfoldings. In other words, that humanity sort of learned to work and devised meditations around ways that the brain just sort of naturally wanted to do it. But that doesn't mean that they're the optimal ways to do it, right? We know from bioengineering and all of that stuff that's going on right now that just because nature wants to do it a certain way, it's not necessarily the optimum way. And so I really have suspected for a long time that even though we've spent a decade with these categories and doing research into this and whatever else, that there might come a day where these categories were irrelevant. So one of the things that I really wanted to do to test this technology was to get back on a plane and fly back to Jay's lab at the University of Mexico at the time, one of the other great brainstem hubs aside from Bashar's place, at the Medical University of South Carolina, and test that theory out. And so, you know, we have a reasonable idea of what the major regions in the brain are that you would want to zap if you could get to them, and what they might do. And so I took my best guess, basically, and we stimmed me in a certain way, in sort of a certain pattern. And sure enough, it was able to produce a novel form that I had not had reported prior in fundamental well-being, and frankly a better form. Like, there are a couple of things that like you sort of live with, because this is an awesome way to live with, but you know, to live, but you maybe would change a couple of things here and there if you could. So I tweaked sort of one of those things. There's a deep peace that comes with this that can affect motivation in certain ways, right? And so I've always been curious, like, can we get around this motivation thing? Can you vary peace with motivation instead of pain with motivation? Because a lot of motivation basically comes from pain, from psychological pain and whatnot. That's what sort of drives high motivation in lots of cases. So I wanted to see, could you put this deep fundamental peace, could you co-vary that? And it actually wound up working. And so we have great experimental evidence around this. And so in the next two talks, you're going to hear from what I think is the most cutting edge stuff in this space. The next talk is going to be Jay Sanguinetti, who is now out here and working mostly out here. He still has his lab in New Mexico, and he still works with the University of Arizona and other people, because there's not a lot of people doing ultrasound, and he's like one of the guys who knows how to do it. There's not that many of them. And he's going to really sort of walk you through that ultrasound technology. The other is Sanjay Manchandra, who's going to come after him. And Sanjay is going to talk about another type of technology that deals with light. And what we're finding are interesting synergies between these, and interesting interplays between these types of technologies. So for many years, people talked about TDCS, TACS, these various types of brain stimulation. You've seen them, you know, for a very, very long time. 9-volt nirvana, right, was the famous article back in the day, and stuff like that. But they never seem to really produce this type of thing. But there are two technologies. We've been pushing the light technology for a couple of conferences now, ever since the first headsets came out that dealt with it. But now we've really gotten custom versions of those. We've been able to experience them with new frequency patterns and a lot of additional complexity. And so Sanjay is going to cover that piece of it. And these seem to be really quite synergistic. And so that's why for this title I chose kind of a provocative, you know, kind of a provocative title for this talk. And that is that brainstem for these types of fundamental well-being, so-called higher states of consciousness, a very sort of common vernacular term, is really here. It seems to really be here. It's able to modulate it. It's able to change it. I've experienced it firsthand. I've seen it. I've seen other people experience it firsthand, frankly, with both of these technologies. And so it's really, I think, a new day and a very exciting day for all of humanity as these continue to get worked on. And so in this block, which has traditionally been our like important keynote block at the TransTech conference, this year I really wanted to feature these two types of technologies. And I wanted to give you all sort of a grounding in why we did that, and why I think that these technologies that you're about to hear are so amazing. If you haven't picked up a bag with a book in it, you know, please do that. I spent a lot of money on these books for you people, so don't leave a book behind. You know, it's all right.